Hey guys, it's Mike with another MLS update, and today we're going to be focusing on the Canadian men's national team and some of the MLS players who will be hoping to see their names on the final roster coming this Sunday. So to really focus on that, happy to say that Peter Galindo is back to join me to really discuss the Canadian side of all this. How are you doing, Peter?
Good, Mike. Thanks for having me back on. It's getting down to the nitty gritty here. So everybody in Canada is starting to ramp up because the squad announcement's coming, and then just shortly after that, you got the Japan friendly, and then the big one, the World Cup opener against Belgium. So we're getting excited over here.
Yeah, I can imagine. We're seeing the teams come out for your rivals in the group. The other three countries have given their rosters, and you know what you're going to be coming up against. But like you say, the excitement's getting there. I guess there's a bit more nervous tension maybe than there was previously after this long qualification campaign. The elation of that. How was the feeling around the media and Canada as a whole for this World Cup? Now it's so close.
It's funny. It feels like people still can't really quite believe it because as it gets closer, everybody's now saying, okay, can you believe that in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
the Canadian men are going to be playing at a World Cup? And they're going to be playing against Belgium. They're going to be playing against Croatia. They're going to be, and then they're rattling off all the names. And even for someone like myself, who has watched the best players in the world now for a couple of decades, to think that your own country is going to be doing that, it takes a while to wrap your head around it, and it kind of makes you realize. Especially if you're from a country where you regularly qualify for tournaments and it's almost like an anomaly for you, just how special these tournaments can
Mm.
be for these maybe not so much debutantes, but certainly countries that have had long World Cup droughts or long Euro droughts or long droughts of any kind. What that can do for just the spirit of the country and the fact that football isn't the number one sport here, I think that's only going to drive up excitement even more because then I think people are really going to get into it now that they have a proper rooting interest.
Yeah, I can only imagine, especially with the hosting of the next World Cup. Join is so good to have this experience for fans to then have another 4 years of excitement building up, ready to know there's another one on the horizon. So
Exactly.
yeah, this campaign has got so many different has so many different parts to it that are so exciting for the fans to get back there, get back involved in national team football for the men's rather than just the women's. And now for these young players who are all looking to make their mark on a squad that they may not, some of these may not get a huge amount of minutes in this tournament, but they're putting themselves forward for some of these aging players who won't be available in 4 years' time. So it's a really interesting sort of scenario now at the moment in Canadian soccer, and yeah, it must be yeah, those compelling emotions of excitement and nervousness going into it. Yeah, it must be it must be fun, and for John Herdman, it's a lot of work to really get organized. And you mentioned that we've got the Bahrain game coming up on Friday, so his squad's not going to be announced till Sunday. So we've got a lot of MLS players now having those final opportunities to put their names on that final roster. There's 21 of them have gone. One of them's Liam Fraser, who's playing in Belgium, but the rest are all MLS based. How many do you think, putting a number on a rough number maybe, how many of these players do you think going to this 20-man squad, 21-man squad could be in this final call up?
Well, I think Maxime Crepeau's recent injury, devastating injury, of course,
Yeah.
paid the ultimate price to help LAFC win MLS Cup. His injuries obviously opened up a spot now, probably for James Pantemis to be the number three goalkeeper at the World Cup. And then Dane St. Clair moves up to number two. You got Milan Borjan number one. I do think St. Clair starts the Bahrain friendly just because he'd be the next man up.
Yeah.
So therefore, that would be fine. And that would only end up being, I believe, his second cap. His
Oh,
first cap came against the Cayman Islands in the early round. I don't even think he touched the ball, apart from,
okay.
I think, one goal kick. Other
Yeah.
than that, so, it might be a slightly different outcome for him in that regard. I still don't think he'll be tested too much, but at least he'll get his feet wet again. He's coming off a brilliant season for Minnesota. So, look, if disaster strikes and Borjan gets hurt, I think he'll be fine. should he have to come in and deputize. I think after that, because you got St. Clair, Pantemis, I think Daniil Henry gets in. Obviously, Kamal Miller makes the cut. Joel Waterman, I imagine, is now a lock, even though he didn't get called up until, when would this have been? It would have been September, but then before that, 18 months prior. But because of the Scott Kennedy injury, I think that opens up a spot for him, as well as possibly Derek Cornelius, who isn't here, but I think he'll make the final squad as well. And then other than that, I really think that your typical suspects like Alistair Johnston, Richie Larea, Mark Anthony Kaye, Jonathan Osorio, Ismail Kone, Samuel Piet, and then probably Lucas Cavallini are the guys who will make the cut. Otherwise, unless injury strikes, maybe you see like a Liam Fraser getting in there if maybe, the midfielders aren't up to snuff. But I really don't think you're going to see very many surprises otherwise.
Okay, so I mean, we've got mentioning beforehand, you've got this fantastic front line coming from Europe, for like Jonathan David, Carl Larin, Alfonso Davis, who plays quite high up as well with Canada, slightly different to his role in Bayern Munich. For those you've mentioned, Lucas Cavallini is a different type of forward, I guess you could say, to those other strikers. Ayo Akinola is in this squad as the other sort of striker in going to Bahrain, sort of the more out and out striker, along with Jaden Nelson, Schaffelberg, more attacking players. Does this seem like a place to test those three for more of a, let's see where they're at now and give them advice for the next few years of going into other like Gold Cup and things like that? Or are they fighting for this place with Cavallini?
I would say that they would maybe give him a little competition. I still think Cavallini gets in regardless, because I know people focus on the suspensions and his discipline with Vancouver, but he is coming off one of his best club seasons of his career when it comes to the goals scored, when it comes to even just his involvement in build-up, which he hasn't always been involved in, even dating back to his Puebla days or when he first came to Vancouver, what have you. So I do think that he deserves to get there on merit. Clearly, the discipline is probably the X factor in a negative way for him, but having those younger players like Jacob Schaffelberg, like Ayo Akinola are going to help him. And I think for a guy like Schaffelberg, who after joining Nashville on loan from Toronto, I really do think that should he stay in Nashville in 2023, which it looks like he probably will, and then kind of pick up where he left off from this past season, I actually think he could end up getting into that March squad for the Nations League and then potentially even be in contention for the Gold Cup squad. If you want to give maybe, say, one or two of your European wingers like Liam Miller a bit of a rest over the summer. So, I do think that there are at least options for some of these younger players to make a case, not so much for the World Cup, but for 2023, and what's still going to be a pretty monumental year for the national team, because there's going to be two trophies up for grabs that they could very realistically win.
Yeah, it's good. You've got that interesting part of hosting where you don't have the qualifying process. So it brings more to these other two tournaments. And if you can go into the World Cup with a trophy come 2026, then it does help the squad, doesn't it? And the confidence around, you can only imagine, will be just already boosted, but it will go sky high with the trophies to take there. Dropping back into the midfield bit, with the way Hubman sets up, is it quite often? I've been looking back at some of the games with the wing backs, three at the back. So there's sort of those quite often the two sort of holding man central midfield. Is that what you're anticipating throughout the World Cup this year, over this winter break?
I am very torn about this, because he did say, Herdman, that he's going to switch to a trio for the Bahrain game, but that's mostly to get some of those players some minutes and to shake off the rust, like your Osorios and Kays, as two examples. I do think come World Cup time, you're going to see almost a hybrid. And I feel like hybrid is a good way to describe Herdman's system, because they morph in and out of different systems and formations throughout games. We've seen them go 3-4-3, 4-4-2, 3-5-2. It really mixes up. And as Herdman told me in his press conference after this Bahrain squad got announced, they have utilized about 4 different kinds of midfield setups. And I do think that come the World Cup, you're probably going to see still what looks to be a double pivot, but I think they're going to get extra cover or support, certainly off the ball when they're going up against a Kevin De Bruyne, for example,
Yeah.
um, from a guy like Junior Hoylett, who is comfortable kind of playing in a free role, but then when he has to, kind of tucks in to form a trio in the midfield and then sort of go from there. And then when they go forward, he kind of goes out to the wing or does whatever he pleases. So I think there's going to be a little flexibility there. But for this Bahrain game, you're probably going to see three out and out central midfielders, whether that's just throwing out an example here, but you go Piet, Osorio, and Fraser, for example, or you throw in an Ismail Kone in there to give yourself some offensive injection. They could go many different ways in that regard.
But yeah, it's interesting you say that how it's changing, and I guess Herdman's got to now prepare for the fact that the opposition are very different to what they've been playing against in CONCACAF as well. So his system he may be looking at adding these changes that he thinks will benefit the team come these tournament games. One person you just mentioned there that I'm curious about is Jonathan Osorio. Obviously, he's missed quite a lot of game time recently. How are people in Canada seeing his preparations going into this, and how ready does he seem, or is there still some question marks over that?
I think there's going to be question marks inevitably because when
Yeah.
you've only played, what is it, one competitive game since I want to say the middle of August, due to ongoing neurological issues, there's going to be concern there.
Yeah.
Now, it seems like in the scrimmages with Toronto FC to finish the season, he progressed well. He was looking positive in terms of his fitness and in terms of his touch was fine. Everything was looking all right. But it's different when you then put that into match practice, even against a Bahrain type. So luckily for Osorio, there are going to be two preparatory matches to kind of gear himself up for the World Cup, which are almost coming in the best order because you have that match against Bahrain where you can kind of take a few more risks, shake out the rust as it were. And then you kind of go up another level when you face Japan on the 17th, even if it's for a half an hour or less than that, that could still prove very, very effective. And then you go up against Belgium. And I don't know if he starts against Belgium anyways, but again, if he is able to show positive progress in those friendlies, he can be a very, very useful substitute off the bench for X amount of minutes.
Mm. Yeah, I can imagine. Obviously, you've got players like Eustachio in Europe, so we're not looking at a fully MLS central midfield there. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to see how he gets on in these games. And I guess it's nice having Bahrain and then to Japan with Japan's so high pressing. So like, as the US found out, it will definitely test. It'll definitely test how quickly his reactions are in a match situation to see how ready he is. I think that's it's a really clever decision from the men's national team to have that one as the final friendly going into that. I was obviously watching Toronto's up and down season and Mark Anthony Kaye coming back in. Some of the towards the end of the season when Toronto were realizing that the playoffs were too far and they couldn't quite get there. I found some of their play was not quite as energetic as it once was in the middle, and the central midfielders weren't pressing quite as much. Sitting back down, does that change any of the thoughts towards some of these players, maybe like Ismail Kone, who's getting so much talked about him and future moves forward? Does this change where Kaye's standing is amongst the group at all?
I would say it has to, and it's very unfortunate because when Kaye got traded to Toronto, he was exactly what they needed in terms of just that mold of a midfielder who can progress the ball, who can go box to box. And then he gets hurt. Jayden Nelson replaces him admirably, considering that really wasn't his primary role, but he did well and earned the call up to this camp, which is more than deserved. And when it comes to a player like Kaye, he needs to be in rhythm. And I know that that's very obvious for any player, but especially someone like Kaye who relies so much on just feeling out a game because he needs to know, okay, when are these openings going to present themselves so I can get a pass through there or, start to dribble or pick my spots maybe to arrive late to the box and get a shot away. he's a player who really needs to be playing regularly to get the most effectiveness, out of him.
Yeah.
Because when you see him when he isn't really in rhythm, as we saw in that US game in January in Hamilton, you could see that the lack of match fitness really caught up to him. Not so much Jonathan Osorio, who I thought had a decent game considering he had a pretty long layoff himself, but Kay is the one who struggled, especially in possession, just didn't get his reads right, didn't get his timing right. So that's, again, another reason why I think this Bahrain friendly could be very useful, because he did get some games towards the end of the season, and you could see he was slowly starting to put it together. But I think getting into that setting with, at least some pretty competent players has to be said, because even though this is a largely domestic-based squad, still some very good players in that team. And then you work your way up to possibly playing against Japan and, feeling out of a game that's going to be, for lack of a better term, I hate to use it, chaotic, but it's going to be very fast-paced, right? And I think in a game like that, Kay will really thrive, so that'll be fascinating.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. They had such a it was such an exciting moment on paper for Toronto when you had added him to that trio with Osorio and Bradley. The idea of the three of them together was like enviable across the league. It was, but injuries and issues caught up, unfortunately, and it seemed to damage the whole side. It's quite difficult for Toronto. They had that 11 on paper that looked like when they've got those out, everything looked in rhythm. Was it Charlotte they just destroyed with such free-flowing football, and it just all looked to click. But when forced into so many changes, it's been a little bit unfortunate for those Canadian players, really, that haven't been able to go into this tournament on the highest form that they had showed throughout the different parts of the year. But looking at those, talking about Toronto, obviously Richie Laryea came back to make sure that he was getting a lot of match fitness and contributing at Toronto, and he made a great impact. A team that were really struggling defensively, he did as much as he could, but he's also very good going forward and contributed that way. Does he look like a starter coming into to the World Cup?
I feel like just because of not so much circumstances that were in his control, but just because Alistair Johnston has had such a tremendous season, it seems like Herdman's going to roll with pretty much all four of Sam Adekubi, Kamal Miller, Stephen Vittoria, and then Johnston. Now, if he decides to utilize Johnston primarily as a center back in a back three, and he doesn't have this hybrid role where sometimes he's a center back, sometimes he's a right back, then Laryea for sure can crack a starting lineup. I think he'll end up starting a game, because there are going to be certain matches, like I look at Morocco, where the wings are going to be very important. So having strength out wide is going to be vital. And I think that that's going to be a game that he starts. But that actual opener against Belgium, I don't see it happening, just because when you look at the last probably 2, 3, maybe even 4 games off the top of my head for Canada, Laryea has started half of them and then usually is taken off by the end. So, and Johnston usually finishes 90 minutes and he's fine to do either, the center back or right back role. So again, it's unfortunate, but I mean, a very good, capable backup to have in Richie Laryea if you ever need it. So
it's good. With looking at that, Alistair Johnston as a national team, is it exciting to see him being able to do those two roles? He's predominantly a right-sided defender for Montreal, and he's shown, like, before Nashville brought in Shaq Moore, you could see how much they missed him throughout that time. He's a very, very good player, and he has that the same as Richie Laryea. He can get forward as well. The delivery of crosses and the forwards you have will thrive off of that from both sides. But is it a concern, or are you confident with the fact that he has to play in that? He's quite often used in a central defensive role. Is that for the other centre backs that you have available to you? Does he stand up above some of them in their natural position?
I would say so. His distribution's become very, very solid over the last year or so. And it's funny because when he broke through, he really did make his name as a defensive-minded right back. So when he started getting his first caps for the national team in guess this would have been March of 2021, maybe even after that, everybody thought, oh, okay, he's going to be, a very defensive minded backup for Richie Larea if we ever need it. And that didn't end up happening. Now it's Alistair Johnston who's the offensive dynamo in the team, which
Yeah.
and even for Montreal, he was able to show that off all season with some impeccable crossing. So that to me is where he does stand out. The only weakness he has is just in the air.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of Canada's matches where they've conceded goals, more often than not, it's at the back post, and Johnston's the one marking the back post, and he just gets out jumped or he just doesn't read the situation well. And look, he is a fullback at the end of the day. And when he was playing in college, he was a number 6 or a number 8. Yes, he engaged in the odd aerial duel, but it wouldn't have been his specialty.
No.
That's the one deficiency he has playing at center back. Whereas someone like a Joel Waterman, who is a capable ball playing center back, is also good in the air. But just because Johnson has the familiarity, the tactical chemistry, the overall chemistry with the rest of the back line, he's the obvious choice. You just have to kind of live with that one weakness. And listen, if you have to, just put Steven Vittori at the back post, park him there and say, sweep up everything you possibly can if you absolutely have to.
They've it's interesting how good that Montreal side have been to be able to utilize them so much in the national team as well. It must watching the season as they've progressed throughout it, unfortunately falling out in the playoffs to New York City FC, but that the way that they play as a club as well, it appears as from an outsider who doesn't watch Canada as much as others, that they play in a system that's well enough for them to come into the national team confident to pick up what they're being asked to do.
Yeah, and for a team that does pride itself building from the back, well, really Montreal and Canada both do, when you have players who are comfortable under pressure, who can progress the ball out of really tricky situations, that really helps you. And I've been saying now for a couple of months, it wouldn't be the worst idea for John Herdman to get Wilfred Nancy on the phone and say, hey, do you want to come to the World Cup as an assistant and kind of help us prepare, how to beat Belgium's high press or Croatia's high press and kind of maneuver our way through that? Because when you watch Montreal play, they invite that pressure. And then when they do that, they just so capably weave their way through it. And then suddenly they have a counterattack that you never really saw coming. And then they end up pouncing and scoring. And for a team like Canada that has a lot of pace, especially in the wide areas, and you're going up against, for example, Belgium, who has quite a slow defense, that could maybe behoove them a lot.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. He has performed incredibly as a manager, Wilfried Nancy, and for obvious reasons, being linked with other clubs who will see him and hope to take him because of just how well he's done. And it is really interesting from an outside point of view to see the similarities with the national team and the way they are playing as well. And for these Canadian sides, obviously the roster restrictions around MLS, the Canadians often taking up a sort of international slot for the US based teams. So you've got a lot of them playing together, coming through academies together, obviously, and playing MLS regularly together. And that must help to be able to be in the same league environment, but to be playing regularly together must make it a lot easier for John Herdman, knowing that we've already got this morale. So it's now just getting on board.
Yeah, and he's talked about that before. Like it is obviously vital, and Canada for a long time hasn't really had that before. Like you're starting to see on the men's and women's side too, like you're starting to see a lot of players joining the same club, and then because of that, especially when it's all in one position as well, which is obviously very beneficial. All the more reason why it's just super effective to have all those players playing in the same environment, and then when they come in, it's just a seamless transition.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how much Montreal and Toronto have amongst this group. Very few over in Vancouver are currently called up. Thomas Hasal has come in though, and obviously for the tragically injured Maxime Crepeau, it's the the goalkeeping side, I was listening to your Northern Football podcast the other day and talking about how you've got so many different options coming through now at a young age and so varied. Does that jump out to you as amongst like the types of goalkeepers being developed by these clubs differently, by the three majority MLS sides? Are they training their goalkeepers differently and providing these options?
I would say they might be. Now, I would imagine in a couple of years, provided Nancy stays at Montreal and whatnot, that Jonathan Sirois, who's going to be the next goalkeeper coming through the Montreal system, he had a pretty impressive loan with Valor in the CPL. He will be someone who I wonder if they're going to make him a little more comfortable in possession than, say, a Bretza or a Pantemis was. Thomas Asal is a capable enough player in possession, and he's comfortable enough building from the back, but he's also a very good shot stopper. He's got good command of his area. The only thing he probably has to do is fill out a little bit, which I think Pantemis has done recently. And look, a lot of goalkeepers, even Maxime Crepeau, he didn't really start to break through until he was about 24, 25, and Asal just turned 23.
Yeah.
He's still got another season or two, I think, to kind of reach that level. And there is a reason why Vancouver did trust him as their number one as soon as they traded Crepeau at such a young age, because they do see the potential. They do see that the body of work that is there, the foundation that is there, is worth building off of. So are there areas where he could improve? Yes, I do think he became more aggressive this season, a little more decisive with his decision making, which you have to have as a goalkeeper. Yeah. And then that's why I think post-injury, he was a lot better than he was pre-injury, not to mention the fact that I think Vancouver then had at least a more settled team compared to when he first started the season.
Yeah, definitely. Their starting 11 especially seemed a lot more set. Defensively, they still had things that they appeared to be trying to do, or thoughts to maybe next season to bring in new players. But I find that quite an interesting position going into the next World Cup, especially because of the age of Borjan. He's obviously going to be, he's getting along a bit. The Red Star Belgrade goalkeeper, this you'd imagine will be his last World Cup. And it's a bit hard for these players to be taking his spot now, especially with the lack of international caps. A number of these, like you say, the number 2, St. Clair, maybe on his second cap this weekend. But these players will be looking to 4 years' time to be fighting for those places, I guess.
Probably. And I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility that Borjan is at least in the picture, maybe not as the starter, but, he could be a nice experience. I do think that he'll probably have one eye sort of set on retirement, just so I don't want to say like he, kind of transitions towards retirement, but I'm sure that the constant travel for a guy who's 6'5", he had to fly from Belgrade over to North America. I'm sure he'd rather avoid that trip if he could. So, and the fact that you do have such quality goalkeepers behind him probably makes that decision a lot easier, because then John Herdman maybe doesn't have to pressure him and say, listen, do you think you could stick around for just another year and kind of wait it out? So there are benefits both ways.
So just talking about those, obviously, Borjan at one end of the career, looking at players like Ishmael Kone, who have been breaking through as young players. He's had the joy of playing alongside Victor Wanyama, Piet as well, obviously, national teammate in Bahrain this year. Looking at your neighbours, the US, they've talked about having this young squad and they're going in fearless. They've got a lot of confidence. Players like Kone, is he a player that we could be seeing in going into the World Cup as one of those players that he's had the attention of Europe on him? He's confident. He's been playing very well in MLS, and he can go in with very little fear.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about confident and fearless. That's Ismail Kone to a T. So, no wonder why he is in the squad, because ever since he debuted earlier this season against Santos in the Champions League, he's just been unfazed by pressure, really. And the only time you've really ever seen him, I suppose, struggle would have been against Panama in World Cup qualifying, when he got a start in that game to close out the cycle. And, I mean, again, it was very hot. The pitch was heavy. It was the end of a, qualifying cycle. 3 days prior, they had qualified for the World Cup. So, I mean, I'm sure it was a little difficult to get thrown in there. And it was only his, I believe that was like his 9th professional game. So, you're bound to, I think, have a bit of an off day
Yeah.
when you're that young and that inexperienced. But to his credit, he's continued to progress and progress. And, he's a player that's going to be an X factor off the bench for Canada. He's probably not going to start games, but you want someone who is going to come in there, grab the game by the scruff of the neck, and just try things with lots of confidence and without fear. Ismail Kone is your guy, because he'll play like he's been there before, done that before, and then you realize, oh my God, he's 20 years old and this is his first full year as a professional. This is absolutely wild. And when you look at the likes of Paxton Aronson going to Eintracht Frankfurt for $4 million in add-ons, that makes you wonder, how much is a guy like Ismail Kone going to go for, and where is he going to go, especially now that he's going to have World Cup experience on top of everything else.
Yeah, you can only imagine, obviously, because I think I remember reading the links of Sheffield United previously, and maybe not following what's happened and the processes of why that broke down, but maybe him and his team are seeing so much more interest coming in for him, possibly, or him setting a different bar for where he wants to leave Montreal from. And we see him coming up in those Montreal games, and you say that he takes the games by the scruff of the neck. You see him appearing in all sorts of areas of the pitch at times. He's just got such an engine on him and so much energy to go. It must be exciting to know that you've got these players coming through at so quickly, being comfortable as professionals.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the one thing that is almost weird to wrap your head around, because typically there's always been this pessimism when it comes to Canadian football, really. And the fact that you're seeing all these young guys coming through, and they just have such poise, and they just, the way that they play is just so easy on the eye, and they're so technically gifted, and it kind of makes you realize, okay, this is really the dawn of a new era here, because outside of your Davieses and your Davids, you've now got players like Ismail Kone coming through who are, just, they're going to be the future. And you can see just the fact that, as John Herdman says, he has tier 1 potential. And that's exactly what I believe scouts at Norwich said when he was linked there, that he does have potential to be like a top tier Premier League player in a couple of years, which kind of speaks to just how highly coveted he is.
Yeah, it's really exciting. It's really exciting to see how the academies have continued to grow, and obviously got the Canadian Premier League as well now. So there's so many more opportunities for these young players to keep coming through, and you can only imagine it could continue to get better and better. And when this is the bar already, it's exciting times. Who do you feel amongst this squad and amongst these MLS-based players, who are probably the player who will be most unfortunate to miss out, that maybe MLS fans will think, oh, they've got to be in the squad, how are they not there come Sunday?
I would say the one name that stands out to me would be Raheem Edwards, because when you look at who Canada's probably going to call up, there's not going to be a lot of out and out left backs in the squad. You got Sam Adekubi. We know Alphonso Davies can play there, but he'll play further forward for Canada. Richie Larea has played there, but as we know, he's more of a right-sided player. And if you're looking at direct replacements for an Adekubi type, or even if you're looking at getting someone in a slight Davies mold, Raheem Edwards is your guy. He is a ball progressing machine, and he's almost like the Energizer Bunny when he plays for the Galaxy, because he's up here, he's back here, he's over here, he's just running around constantly, and he's working hard off the ball. Is he the most proficient defender? No, but he does press a lot. He is going to work hard off the ball. He is going to get very involved in your build-up play. He'll make those overlaps in the final third. He'll get good crosses into the box. So if you were looking at someone to provide that and maybe give Adekubi a rest, Raheem Edwards might have been the next man up, and he still could end up making the squad. We don't know. I don't think he does, but he would be the one guy who you might look at, especially with the season he's had for the Galaxy, and even going back to last year with LAFC, and think, that's a bit unfortunate that he did miss out in the end.
And obviously the clubs this year can bring 26 players the head coach has got 3 extra players to play with than they have at previous World Cups. Who from an MLS point of view do you think will benefit the most from John Herman going, well, okay, 24, 25, 26, yeah, you
Right.
could feel that one.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I think Joel Waterman for sure, as I mentioned
Yeah,
kind of off the top, is going to be one of those names because you're kind of lacking competent right-footed options at center back. So he'll probably be one name that you would say, yes, I imagine he gets in and makes the cut. Ismail Kone, I think, is benefiting from that.
mm,
Plus the fact that there are going to be a couple of midfielders who you have maybe fitness concerns about,
yeah,
but also the fact that you can take that risk and bring up another midfielder if you want, that's going to help him. And maybe not now, but certainly in the future when Herdman probably will call up 25, 26 players leading up to the Gold Cup and Nations League. I think Jacob Schaffelberg is also going to benefit if he can
yeah,
continue this. And even maybe someone like a Jaden Nelson, if he can somehow find minutes in what's going to be a pretty loaded TFC team next
mm,
year, I can imagine just based on the changes they're going to make. But I mean, if he can have a season similar to this one, who's to say that he can't get in as another winger or even as an option in the midfield? Because as we've
mm.
seen, he can fill that role pretty competently too.
Yeah, it's really helped him. I think like when all these signings came in, obviously he was anticipating Insigne coming. Then all of a sudden
Mm.
Bernardeschi's announced.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
must
yeah,
have been quite daunting for a young player to go, oh, the 2 Italian internationals are now filling
yeah,
the spots that I would have taken.
yeah,
To
yeah.
go into that central role and change his game somewhat was it's really exciting to see as an option going forward, to know he's capable of adapting. And Schaffelberg, like you mentioned as well, Nashville had so little going forward without Hani Mukhtar. I felt Schaffelberg came in and added that sort of extra bit of life to their attack, which
Hmm.
a lot of the time was really missing. But we'll have to see. I'll be curious to see whether he does stay. I'm assuming he'll stay in Nashville again and for another season, and he'll get a bit more game time and a bit more playing with some of these other players and going forward in a different type of system, see how he adapts. But how was MLS for you watching it, especially for these probably the last 3 or 4 years, as the teams are now the national team has been developing, the players that these Canadians sides are coming up against week in, week out now, as MLS continues to bring in some younger players with wider international experience. It's not the 10, 15 years ago where it was considered a retirement league in Europe. You've got all these younger players with so much quality that they're coming up against week in, week out. How has that helped the Canadian national team?
I think slowly but surely it's getting there. I
Mm,
do think that the salary cap maybe doesn't help in some ways, like in terms of getting maybe better quality defenders. Like I think that would be
yeah,
the next step, sort of. Like if you can somehow loosen the salary cap restrictions or even just open it up completely to allow you to just sign whoever you want defensively because you cut corners with the salary cap and
yeah,
maybe don't spend as much on a fullback unless you're Toronto FC.
yeah,
And maybe that could be the next step. But certainly the fact that you're bringing in, say, young players from South America, or some, as we saw with Bernardeschi and Insigne and Gareth Bale and all these players coming over who were still at least relatively in their prime, if not in
yeah,
their prime, coming over. That really aids the quality of the league as well. Because the one thing that I always take away from most games, at least, is that it is very fast paced
yeah,
and you do have to keep up. So the
yeah.
fact that these Canadian players are playing in that environment week in, week out, I think that has benefited them when they've had to step into a national team role and go up against a Uruguay or eventually a Japan or a Belgium.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how I get on, especially with these, like you say, there's not much invested in the defense. I mean, it's Walker Zimmerman is the designated player, but I struggle to remember any other sort of designated players in the defensive line. It's
Yeah,
all
yeah,
going
yeah.
forward. So for these young players coming through and sort of the domestic defenders like Montreal have, must be it gives them something different to come up against as they go through their professional careers before going to Europe or before representing their country against some of these other teams. who do you think is going to be a standout player that we should watch out for in MLS that's really going to lead this team from an MLS point of view as we go into the World Cup?
Other than Kone, because I think that is the obvious choice, I do think that Alistair Johnston is going to really wow a lot of people. And the fact that he's 24 still, he can play multiple roles and has so many different qualities. I think that's really going to appeal to a lot of teams. And then the fact that Montreal does have the Bologna links, thanks to Joey Saputo, the owner, that could maybe get him kind of a backdoor entrance into Europe. Plus, he has a UK passport. So therefore, if he wants to go to, say, the championship, it'll be a lot easier for him to do that. Even though, just based on where Canada is in the world ranking and how many minutes he has, getting a work permit wouldn't be a major problem, but it's just an extra, precaution or guarantee, to have the local, but the passport to make it easier for him to get into England. So he would be the one that I'd look at and say, he's probably going to have a pretty big tournament. And I think that's going to put teams on notice because he's going to be available for what's going to be a pretty valuable price, at least in terms of when you look at, other market rates for domestic defenders in MLS. If you only have to spend a few million, I'm sure a lot of European clubs will take that in a heartbeat.
Yeah, it's for the different budgets that they operate on. A few just like single figures in the millions is quite often seen by some as a worthwhile gamble.
Exactly.
So yeah, what would you say the expectations are now for Canada going forward into this World Cup and amongst the group and the media and also what are your hopes for how far they can get in this tournament with a very difficult group to come up against?
It is a very tricky group, no doubt about it. And I think because of that, all these expectations from people vary. Like I've heard if they score a goal, I'll be very happy. And then I've heard too, if they get a point or get a win, I'm going to be ecstatic too. You know what? They could probably get out of the group. We'll see, which I think is maybe a little bit of a stretch. But I have said for a few weeks now that I feel like Canada's almost going to be in that group what Iran was 4 years ago in that Spain and Portugal group, and that they could probably get a point off the big boys. They could probably hold their own. And especially when you have a couple world-class players who can make the difference, that's going to help Canada a lot. But I don't think they ultimately get out of the group just because those big two teams of Croatia and Belgium are just going to have that little extra bit of individual quality to maybe put them over the top. Even if they get outplayed in certain aspects, they're going to have that advantage. And I think that's where Canada maybe learned some harsh lessons, but that's fine. They're 4 years ahead of schedule. The plan was to qualify, to get into 2026 with this exciting young group, use the 2022 qualifying cycle as almost preparation for that. What better preparation to have for 4 years from now when the team is probably going to start to peak than going up against some of the best players on the planet 4 years before you were probably ever planning on doing so.
Yeah, it's excellent for the way that Canada have qualified, and obviously with the way CONCACAF's organized, those players from Europe couldn't come to a lot of the qualification process. So it's as a group and as a national team setup, did that show a lot of confidence in the team, knowing that these players that we're developing at home who are playing domestically were able to stand up, and we could bring in these stars when we could, but we know we have this group.
Yeah, and I think that's the importance of the tactical identity of the team, because as we saw at the Gold Cup, they were missing, I think, up to 5 or 6 key players in that semifinal against Mexico, and you had almost forced extra time against them. They were able to respond very well to some big adversity, and that hasn't always been the case before, even under John Herdman with everybody available. So the fact that they've been able to prove at different times that no matter who's out there on the pitch, we're going to be able to do a job. We're going to give ourselves a chance to win. That does wonders for the confidence of the group, especially when you can prove it constantly. It's not just a one-off. I think that's going to help a lot of people. Now, that being said, if Alphonso Davies had missed the World Cup due to that hamstring injury, I think everybody would have been very nervous. But at the very least, they could say, you know what? we're not going to get walked off the pitch at the very, very least. We'll be able to hold our own somewhat, but at least with Davies there, they'll be able to possibly do some damage.
Yeah, I can imagine, and for fans who probably have gone through, there's generations of fans who haven't seen Canada at a World Cup, so it must be very exciting to see the country there. I think globally, football fans around the world are excited to see, maybe if they haven't been watching Canada, they're aware of who Alphonso Davies is, who's such an exciting character,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well as a player. It makes a lot of people very curious as to how they'll get on, and hopefully it will be a great advert for MLS as a league, but also especially these three sides, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, about how well they are developing these players going forward, with so many who are born and raised here, as well as obviously from players from other countries, but Canadian. So yeah, it'd be really exciting to see. I hope you get to enjoy the tournament. I know you get to go out there for those group games. Which one are
I
you
do.
particularly looking forward to seeing?
I feel like the opener is the easy answer just
Yeah,
because that is the first game. There's going to be so much excitement. And I think there's also going to be a lot of intrigue from people to see Canada because it seems to be that when they think of Canada, they think of Davies.
yeah,
And then I think when they actually see the team, they're going to be like, oh, okay, interesting. This will,
mm,
they can actually play a little bit here. They got other players that are worth watching. Like I think they're going to really capture a lot of people's imagination. And I'm
yeah,
actually very much looking forward to that first game just because, you know, I feel like Canada's a team that doesn't often play with nerves.
I
So,
agree.
and I think just because they know and they're aware of just how big the task is,
Yeah,
they're almost going to go out there without fear and
yeah.
just and Belgium's almost going to be like, oh my god, what's going on here? Just so it'll be interesting to watch for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be glued to the telly for that. I'll be watching from afar, but I'll be very keen to see how they get on. And can you remind people how they can follow you and some of the work
Yep.
you do, so that we can keep up to date on everything that's going on leading up to the games as well?
Yeah, for sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at Galindo PW. You can follow my podcast, Northern Football, which covers everything Canadian football, and we obviously cover MLS as part of that. At Northern Football on all social media platforms. Subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts, and then come World Cup time, and even possibly as early as tomorrow, because they do play Bahrain on Friday.
Yeah,
Maybe the video is out by then. Who knows? But either way, you will be able to see post-match reaction on Sportsnet, MLS, um, and I'll be tweeting out all those links. So if you want to check that out, you'll see them all there.
fantastic, brilliant, Vito. I really hope you enjoy the whole experience out there as well, and hopefully we see. I'm aware, I believe Canada is still yet to score a goal in a World Cup
Correct.
tournament, so I'm looking forward to seeing who gets hopefully who gets
Yes.
that first goal
Yes.
for the country there, and puts their names in the record books as well. Thanks very much for joining me, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Always happy to join.